Okay, welcome everybody to this second of our SGSAH Summer School 2021 daily keynotes. I'm sure most of you know who I am by now, but in case not, my name's Claire Squires. I'm the director of the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities. And today I'm really happy to have 4 speakers drawn from within our own Scotland-based communities. They're not all actually physically based in Scotland right now, including one of our own SGSAH PhD researchers as well. I'm going to ask them all to just say hello and very briefly introduce themselves in just a moment, but just to set the scene before we get going. As you'll know from the brief of this panel, the theme of the roundtable is how research within the arts and humanities can inform or function as activism, interacting with and underpinning socially just change-making policy. Our speakers' research is frequently conducted in partnership with external organisations, and I know some of them are going to talk about that quite a bit. And looking from gender inequalities in TV and film, refugee histories and lives, and inclusive youth literature and book trade activism. Our panellists will be discussing their research alongside the challenges, opportunities and urgencies of carrying out such activities. So I'm going to go around and ask each of our speakers just to unmute and say hello. Then I'm just going to make another couple of introductory remarks and we'll get going with the roundtable. So first of all, Susan, over to you to say hello.
Hi, I'm Dr. Susan Berridge. I'm a lecturer in film and media at the University of Stirling.
Thanks, Susan. And Katherine?
Hello, I'm Katherine. I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow and I'm in the history department.
Thanks, Katherine. Ben?
Hi, I'm Benjamin Thomas White and I am also in the history department at the University of Glasgow, where I research and teach refugee history.
Great, thanks, Ben. And finally, Melanie.
Hiya, I'm Melanie Ramschambold. I have just joined the University of Glasgow and I am a senior lecturer in children's literature studies.
That's great, thanks very much. As you will all know, these sessions are short lunchtime sessions. We only have 45 minutes or a little bit less than that right now. So our speakers are all briefed to speak for up to around 5 minutes. But we really want this to be an interactive session. So please do get using the chat to add your reactions, your questions, and in fact, knowing, kind of some of you who are here present, some of your own experiences in this field as well, if you want to share them. So do very much use the chat in that way as we go along, so we could make good use of it. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Susan, who's going to kick off for us. Susan, thanks very much. Over to you.
Thanks for inviting me to be here today. Firstly, I've got massive imposter syndrome on this brilliant panel. I am committed to social justice and to feminist activism, but my work isn't directly activist in itself. So it has informed the activities of activist organisations, but I think more centrally, I see my research as being informed by activism and by kind of activist priorities. So my background is that I'm a feminist television scholar. All my work is underpinned by a commitment to addressing gender inequalities on and off screen in the television and wider media industries. So my background in terms of my PhD was looking at representations of sexual violence in teen television, and also thinking about kind of broader gender and sexual inequalities in film and television. And that work was very textual in focus. But as my work has continued, I've become more interested in who has the power to make those representations. And that's led me to researching wider gender inequalities in the media industries off screen, in terms of kind of who makes up the workforce of these industries. So this has led me towards working with activist groups that are located in the industry to identify areas for change and to think about kind of what my research priorities are and my research questions are. Perhaps most centrally, I've worked with Raising Films, who are an activist and community interest organisation that are dedicated to supporting parents and carers in the UK screen sector, recognising the difficulties of negotiating caring responsibilities with work in these industries, And that work really coincided with me having my own kids and experiencing these challenges of balancing work. So a lot of that, it's kind of personally motivated as well. So as part of their activist initiatives, I've worked with them in overseeing data analysis of their surveys. So students on our gender studies program worked with them, and I was kind of supervising that work. I've also taken part in industry-facing events, speaking on panels and contributing to workshops, thinking about what changes need to be made to the sector's working cultures to help address inequalities. And I've acted as academic consultant on their industry-wide surveys as well. This involvement with Raising Films kind of led me to develop my own research project on gendered impact of childcare on experiences of working in the Scottish screen sector. So it sort of all intersects and interconnects in different ways. And again, to ensure the relevance of this work, I've used the findings to engage with third sector organisations like trade unions, for example, such as BECTU, and with funding bodies. My current research project is on intimacy coordination in television, and this is with Dr. Tonya Horrocks of Anglia Ruskin University. And it's really kind of bringing all these areas together. So going right back to my research for my PhD, and thinking about what the relatively new role of the intimacy coordinator might mean for the kinds of depictions of intimacy, consent, and sexual violence that we see on our screens. But we're also thinking about the role that this profession might play in challenging abuses of power in the screen sector as well. So again, there's lots of kind of activist angles to this work, and engaging with third sector parties is really key. We're just starting out on this project, but this is kind of where I'm going at the moment. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks very much, Susan. One of the questions I was going to ask everybody at the end was thinking about how your own kind of personal experiences have interacted with your research and developed your research. And I imagine that might well be the case with some of other speakers as well. And you've already mentioned that. So thank you for kicking us off. I'm going to hand over now straight to Katherine. Over to you, Katherine.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me. And it's great to hear about your work, Susan, and it's so nice to see everybody here. It's great. So just to tell you a wee bit about what I'm involved in, I'm a part-time PhD student, and my project is an oral history project looking at refugee experiences of life in Scotland from the mid-70s up to the present day. And I'm interested in both recording people's experiences and building up a collection of these recordings, but also thinking about ethical ways to record these interviews with people, given that a lot of people have had a very negative experience of a kind of traditional interview with the Home Office as part of the asylum process. So I'm really interested in, and also there's just so many different ways of thinking about how you record someone's experiences, going walking or talking about objects. One of the things that I've been doing recently is working with Maryhill Integration Network, which is an organisation in Glasgow that does a lot of community work and a lot of community arts. And I worked with a group of creative writers at that group, running shared reading and creative writing sessions. And that was, we wrote poetry in a group, like collaborative poetry, and that was based on themes that I'm interested in exploring in my research. So I was able to kind of bounce the themes off people and see what sparked discussion and what kind of fell flat. And that's something that I'm looking to keep doing throughout the PhD, is working with partners, with different organisations, to kind of expand the reach of it. And when I was invited to come along and chat here, I was like, the word activism, I was a bit like, oh man, that sounds a bit full on, like you need to be on the soapbox with the megaphone and stuff like that, and be the face of the movement, right? But really for me, I much prefer to think about solidarity, right? So there's already lots of people being the spokesperson for refugees and asylum seekers, and there really needs to be more opportunity for those kind of public facing roles to be people with lived experience. Like that never needs to be me with that megaphone. So for me, some things that really helped me when I was thinking about this is like, how can I find out what's already going on, what's working well, and how can I support that existing work? And ensuring that what I'm doing is sustainable for me and for the other people that are involved. And I think it's really crucial to think, like, how can you make the best use of your own time and skills? So, for example, you may have seen recently there was a successful community action against the Home Office in Kenmure Street, which is in Pollokshields where I live. And people prevented an immigration raid by surrounding a van. And so attending demos in person like that's not an option for some people who are subject to immigration control or subject to racialized policing. Whereas for me, those risks aren't there. So you need to think, like, what can I do and what am I willing to do? So I think, like, some of the challenges to do with this kind of stuff is, like, there's so much injustice out there, right? And we're all hyper aware of it. You're on social media, stuff's just getting pumped into your brain. And you need to really focus your energy, otherwise you can spend too much time worrying, reading bleak Twitter threads and feeling guilty. And as somebody that spent loads of time doing all of that, it's just not constructive, you know? It's not helpful. So, and I think, like, one of the things I wanted to say was, like, the opportunities of this kind of thing. From my experience, working in partnership with communities, it's made the work much stronger and more rooted in the communities that I'm that the work relates to, and it's brought in perspectives and contributions that I couldn't bring myself. I wasn't able to see things from that angle, and it's really improved the project. And I think, like, my final point really was, like whatever you want to call it, acting in solidarity, activism, community involvement. You need, the crucial thing is, like, it can be really frustrating, but it's also extremely energizing and mind expanding and also just fun, and sometimes we win. Look at Kenmure Street, that was actually successful. Sometimes it has the effect that you want, and even if it doesn't, right, you never know the full impact of what you're doing. So, like, my father always talks about an infinity of traces. So, like, you don't know that what it is. Even if something's feeling futile, you don't know what wee thing you do or you're involved with is going to really stay with somebody and maybe be the thing that changes their perspective or be the kind of spark that sets them off down a totally different road. That's me. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Katherine. And thanks for bringing your dad's an infinity of traces as a phrase into this conversation. I really like that, and I'll think about it a lot. I also was really interested in what you were saying about ethics and also that kind of positioning in terms of acting in solidarity rather than activism, or maybe researching in solidarity we might want to think about as well. So thanks so much, Katherine. That was fantastic. I'm now going to hand over to Ben. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Claire and Susan and Katherine. I just want to say what they said. Thanks, Katherine, for laying it all out so clearly. That's great. I work on refugee history too. I teach refugee history, the histories of population displacements in the world at large since the late 19th century to the present. My research focuses on refugee history, particularly the history of the refugee camp. Perhaps unlike Katherine, my work started 100 years ago in the 20s and 30s for a period for which oral history was not an option. And one of the things that was very striking about my research in refugee history was that quite often you could see that the refugees themselves had been the drivers of what happened. Like a decision to carry out a humanitarian evacuation that was presented as a high-handed act of imperial charity, but it was actually because the refugees were already moving and it had to be done. But it struck me that in the archives, refugees' voices would get left out, which made it harder to see that happening in the historical research. My research started with a period 100 years or so ago, but it, of course, got me thinking about refugees in the present and helped me recognize the ways in which very frequently in public and policy debates about refugees' voices are left out. They are debates about refugees. And quite often, as Katherine said, it shouldn't be me there with the megaphone. If I can do anything as a historian, as an academic, as someone who's got the institutional backing of a 570-year-old institution, it's to say you should be talking to those people and not to me. I can make some contributions to public and policy debates, and I try to. Sometimes they're long thought out, you know, an extended review essay, bringing historical perspectives to critique ungrounded proposals for how refugees should be dealt with. And sometimes it's on the hoof. I'm on Twitter quite a lot, and I once spotted the communications chief of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees posting a picture of a refugee child holding up her identity card, which included her family's name, address, and phone number. And I could coordinate a campaign on Twitter to get her to take down that information, because doxing a child refugee is not a good idea when you are a senior staff member of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. I think bringing some academic sort of weight to things like that can be useful. I often also here in Glasgow work with partner organisations, not just in Glasgow, but beyond. In Glasgow, I work with, say, with the Scottish Refugee Council, or other organisations. Beyond Glasgow, I've worked with international humanitarian organisations, or yes, UNHCR. Sometimes that is bringing them historical perspectives on their work that they don't have time to stop and do for themselves. They don't have time to think about. Sometimes it's developing collaborative research projects. These things always make me a better researcher too. As Katherine said, we get a lot out of these. But something that I found perhaps most valuable, not just for me, but for partners that I work with, is that as an academic who's paid to think, I can run events which create a bit of space for people who work in the refugee sector, say, or for humanitarian practitioners to stop and think about their work as well, away from the daily imperatives of the highly demanding work they're doing. And I think that's one of the most valuable contributions that an academic can make. And I'm going to stop there so I don't run over time.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. And I think that kind of those kind of closing remarks that you made as well about the particular thing that academics can do and can bring is, you know, kind of really useful for us to think about. I talked in the opening and in the framing of this session, I talked about the urgency. And I think Katherine as well, you were talking about, you know, how we can all get sucked in by the social media, by the immediate things that are happening and that we're concerned about, but also thinking, you know, what are the particular skills and, as you said, Ben, institutional placements and what particular benefit can we bring? So thank you for that. Just before I hand over to Mel, I'm going to remind everybody that Mel is going to be the final speaker on the roundtable, and I will continue to ask questions of our speakers, but I'm very keen to have your contributions and questions and thoughts. So please do start using the chat if you want to do that already, but I'll now hand over to Mel. Mel, thank you.
It's absolutely the worst thing to be last, because everyone has said everything that I wanted to say much better. And I'm basically just going to talk about children's books now, which is delightful in itself. And it's thanks for inviting me. And it's been so great to hear Susan, Ben and Katherine's work. I think most of the exciting work that I'm seeing at the moment is, you know, collaborative and has activism at its core, whether that's in academia or the wider book community. So my research centres on children's and young adults books by socially marginalised groups, particularly people of colour. So I not only explore how socially marginalised groups are portrayed in the books, and historically it's been terrible, but I also look at the experience and practices of authors and readers from these socially marginalised groups as well. So inclusive youth literature is the term that's used, and it's vital. It really can shape how young people from socially marginalised groups see themselves and how they feel situated in the world, as well as it, you know, showing readers from dominant groups how they see and understand, you know, diversity and difference. My work has shown that an absence of inclusive and representative characters or creative role models in youth literature has the potential to deter children from, you know, reading and engaging with reading in books, and therefore, experiencing the associated benefits that come from reading. This in turn can lead to a lack of engagement with, the cultural industries as a career, and this further embeds the imbalance. So the lack of quality, and I stress the word quality here, inclusive and representative books that reflects the lives and families and cultures of children and young people has been a really long-standing issue in the UK. There have been many industry panels, discussions, initiatives, etc., to improve this lack of representation or this misrepresentation in and outside of books. But change has been really, really, really slow to happen. And this conversation has actually been going on for decades. So recent research has actually shown that attitudes haven't changed at all in the publishing industry. So in 60 odd years, nothing's really changed. And in children's and YA books, most of the sort of activism and advocacy comes from parents, authors, independent publishers, independent booksellers, etc. And they've been chipping away at these barriers through the years and creating a space for these kind of contributions to the book world. So Clary, when you invited me to this, I queried with the term activism as well, like Katherine, Ben, and Susan, and I don't really see myself as an activist. I feel like I'm using my privilege to create a space for something to happen, and I can. Because I'm not intimately involved in the book trade, I'm not an author, I'm not part of a publisher, I can have these difficult conversations. I can encourage these difficult conversations to happen because actually, I don't need to worry about getting a book deal. I can force these issues. However, these kind of positive changes requires a collective and consistent efforts. And I suppose my activism, if we want to call it that, comes from being involved in these networks and collaborations with creative industries partners and beyond for the last few years. One of my roles has been to provide both longitudinal evidence, which holds publishers accountable, and also qualitative evidence, sometimes action research with authors and readers from marginalised groups, to help create some practical solutions, guides and trainings, which have been a direct intervention with how publishers approach children's and YA books. So through my work with stakeholders, what is evident is that people do actually want to produce better and consume better. And I've been working with lots of different cultural organisations, the Book Trust, Scottish Book Trust, the Centre for Literacy and Primary Education, Spread the Word, Words of Colour, etc. And we've been working together to sort of assist stakeholders further. So for example, one of the things that we have done is devise a series of prompts to guide diverse book selection, whether that's in commissioning or in reading, and support a more critically reflective approach. And that's the key to my work. So the prompts are a distillation of both the positive and problematic practices identified across our work. And this has been devised to help support both consumers and producers to adopt a more critically reflective approach in how they curate, produce and consume youth literature. So I've been working directly with commissioning editors for most publishers in the UK, although not all. And they typically haven't had this sort of training before. And I think it has improved how they've been working with texts. It's difficult to say whether this will constitute ongoing structural change. It's really up to the publishers to continue engaging with this. However, before joining the University of Glasgow, I taught the next generation of publishers at UCL, and so embedded this kind of critical thinking, critical ways of engaging with youth literature into the curriculum. And these students will go on to be leaders in the children's and YA field, the people that will be the decision makers of the future. So take these learnings and critical literacies and critical reflections and of their own biases into their careers. And at the University of Glasgow, I'll be working with people who go into work in youth literature as well, so teachers, librarians, publishers, etc. So these learnings will spread out throughout some of the key gatekeepers and consumers of youth literature, and hopefully empower them to make positive changes in the book world. So I'm kind of ever hopeful about that as well. I'm kind of cautious of the time, so I'm going to stop there, or else I'll start ranting.
I'm sure there should be space within the almost 20 minutes we have available for some ranting, Mel, but thank you so much for that as well. I thought that, again, kind of some really reflective meditations on positioning as academics, and also that point at the end, which I think is how Ben started as well, about thinking about the curriculum and what our role is as teachers. So thinking about refugee history, Ben, you talked about right at the beginning, and also Mel, what you were talking about in terms of educating, you know, kind of future teachers, future publishers, future librarians. So thank you so much for that. Thank you to all four. I do have lots of questions, but I've seen that Sandra has one in the chat already. If there are other people who would like to voice their questions instead, please do raise your Zoom hand and you can unmute and I'll come to you. Sandra, I'll read your question out, but if you want to join us by speaking as well, please do unmute and let us know. But Sandra said, I loved Katherine's analogy of stepping down off the soapbox and putting down the megaphone. I wonder if this is about a need for a shift in the distribution of the labour of activism. Are collaborative efforts more effective, but intrinsically less visible? Who would like to respond to that? I mean, it was obviously kind of responding to Katherine's comments, but it might be any of the four of you have comments in response. Shall I pick someone? Susan, have you got any responses to that in particular? Sorry to pick on you.
No, it's okay. I'm a big fan of collaboration. I think you learn so much more. You know, you can come into things with your own assumptions, and I think it's really important to listen to as many different voices as possible and try and, you know, particularly when you're really passionate about something. I think when I started out with the work around childcare, for example, I was hugely angry in my own life, and I was kind of maybe a little bit blinkered. And so I think that idea of collaboration is really important. Is it less visible? Potentially. I think one of the things I've been trying to do in my research recently is draw attention to collaborative work. That's been more in relation to working cultures in the media sector. So I've been thinking a lot about challenging that idea of the kind of individual genius and trying to draw attention to all the other forms of labour that go on, all the other important networks that happen that maybe aren't valued or taken seriously. So yeah, I think maybe collaborative efforts are less visible, and part of what we can do is draw attention to that importance and kind of advocate for the importance of collaboration. I hope that's makes sense.
Certainly does, Susan. Thank you. Mel, you talked about collaboration as well. Do you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, so I think, well, especially in the book trade, the only way that things are going to shift is if people form these sort of strategic partnerships and collaborations and work together. However, what I wanted to say about collaboration is that, I mean, the best thing about this type of work is that I've developed some wonderful friendships and alliances with like-minded people through these kind of activist networks and communities. So I think as a person of colour, working on issues of race and racism, for example, is exhausting. So having these kind of personal and professional networks has been really invaluable, if that makes sense. So doing this kind of work, you can get diversity fatigue, and actually having these sort of collaborative, these collaborations, these people that you can share your experiences with, has been, has been so invaluable to me.
Thank you, Mel. Actually thinking on that, not necessarily to ask you to respond to this subsequent question as well, but what you say kind of reflects Charlie's question. So Charlie says, for everyone, I'm wondering about your thoughts on self-care in relation to activism and research, especially for those of us that are marginalised ourselves and struggling with resilience for activism and for carving out academic space. Mel, you do want to jump in?
Yeah, I can just quickly say, so Oh my goodness, where do I start? So yes, I have a WhatsApp group. I know there are so many WhatsApp groups, but I have a WhatsApp group with various WhatsApp groups with the people I work with, and we just share our experiences to the extent that we just laugh about them in the end. Some of us have been in situations where people have said incredibly insensitive, you know, offensive and downright racist things in our presence, and that's what we do. I just make sure I share the experience with my colleagues who have now become my friends, and yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to think what else I do off the cuff, but I share my experiences with my friends and colleagues.
Thank you, Mel. Ben.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to say about this, which partly go back to the last question as well, thinking about collaborative efforts, particularly how they're viewed from within universities, because universities models an understanding of research and of what universities term impact or knowledge exchange are often very top-down, very centered on the idea of the individual academic expert, which is something that I really quite strongly disagree with. I think researchers need to listen a lot more and learn, and that collaborative work should be built around that. But collaborative work between academic organizations and non-academic organizations, especially for activist purposes, creates particular pressures on the people who are doing it. So this is a really important question for Charlie to raise, because your activists are fully engaged in the activist field, and researchers who aren't trying to engage with activists can be fully engaged in the research field and navigating the field, their respective fields individually. When you are the bridge between the institutional world of academia and the public sphere of activism, sometimes there's immense pressure on you. I'm thinking and more from the experiences of friends and of my partner, who's a woman of color, not an academic, but was in that kind of position between museums and institutions expect their staff to be going out and doing this kind of work without necessarily making, offering adequate support, and frequently without recognizing how difficult that work is. And of course, quite frequently, they're employing women of color on short-term contracts to do it. which is exploitative in its own way. So the question of self-care becomes absolutely crucial, but you're in a situation where you have fewer resources and less security to allow yourself the time for it. So I certainly don't have an answer to this question, but I did want to flag up the ways in which, for people at the intersection of academia and activism, it's an especially important one.
Can I just jump in and say something here as well, just based on what Ben said? So I did a report a couple of years ago, and it was a fairly innocuous report that basically said people of color are underrepresented in children's authorship. That was the crux of the argument. But it was we got a lot of sort of abuse, racist abuse, because of that. And my other colleague at CLP got death threats for a report that she did. And I have to say that this is when I was at UCL, and they were amazing. And they put in quite a lot of structures to stop that. They put limits on my email account so people couldn't email me. They, you know, contacted the police, etc. So you can't, there is if you approach your institution, there is institutional support that you can get.
If your institution is clued up and good at giving it. And I'm really pleased to hear that UCL were good at that. I know others have not been supportive of their staff. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to that question actually of institutional positioning, but just before we do, Katherine, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add in either around the collaboration question or the self-care. I know you were quite careful to position yourself, obviously, as not one of the migrants or the refugees in what you were talking about, but those questions might still resonate with you.
Yeah, just on the sort of the self-care kind of side of things, like not so much from the perspective of if your institution it has the expectation that you will do that, but more thinking about if you see an injustice and you feel like that's something that you want to get involved in. Something that's really helped me is thinking, like, do I genuinely have the capacity to do it? And like, in order to do it well, you have to have the time and the energy and the resources to devote to it. And sometimes that's just not it's not the right moment for it, and maybe there's other things that you can do. And I found this book to be extremely helpful on this point. It's Mutual Aid by Dean Spade. You see all my wee sticky notes in it. It's really good, and it's very, very practical advice for anybody with things about facilitating meetings and working in collaboration with people. There's a whole chapter about this. It's called No Flakes, No Masters, and just talking about how the kind of almost like managing those expectations with yourself before you embark on stuff. It's a different kind of thing than what the others were talking about, where it's within a workplace and those expectations. But I found it really good, and I'd highly recommend it, having a wee look.
That's great. Thanks very much, Katherine. If there are more questions or comments, please do stick them in the chat or put your hand up. But yeah, I just wanted to turn a bit more to this question about institutional positioning. I mean, Mel, you obviously talked about UCL being very supportive. Ben, you obviously hinted that that's not always the case within university environments. And but could I encourage you to say a bit more about, I suppose it's that role as an academic, but also is there sometimes a conflict with the institution? You know, universities don't always act necessarily in the most socially just manner. They have all sorts of issues with precarity, for example, and that's something that our PhD communities will be very aware about, all sorts of, you know, kind of hierarchical issues which are not socially just at all. Does this kind of work always sit comfortably within the academic environment? Have any of you found any challenges? Ben?
I mean, I'm happy to offer some thoughts, but I don't want to jump in if Susan, Mel, or Katherine want to go. It is challenging, and it can be. There is the problem that the whole impact agenda means that universities want this sort of thing to happen. They don't necessarily want to have to change themselves, and their own ways of appraising the performance of their staff often do not recognize large aspects of this work. For example, the amount of long, slow, and patient work that needs to be done to build up trusting partnerships, which is harder, it's a longer, more difficult task, the more marginalized the groups you are working with are. So for example, I've much more often worked with refugee support organizations than with people who are refugees, partly because basically refugees have enough occupying their time. They don't need me marching in expecting them to help me with my research. Working with refugee organizations is an easier thing for me to manage in my working life as well than it would be to be working with people who are actually refugees. But how the difference in amount of work that's required for those two different things would actually be recognized. You know, you need to have a very, very understanding and aware line manager, and even then, you frequently that your performance and development review, for example, does not include scope to say, well, I spent hundreds of hours this year doing this, and it doesn't show up anywhere in my research outputs. It will make my research outputs in 5 to 15 years much, much better. And more important than that, it will actually have a positive impact in the world outside research. the way administrative structures are set up in universities often means that the things you're spending most time on and that you need to spend time on are not being recognized.
Great.
I'm just going to jump in and say I cannot agree more, Ben. Like, I do so much like engagement and outreach work, which isn't really recognized in my workload. So I do it in all of my own time, which I'm sure all of you do as well. And, you know, as someone with a small child and, you know, a life outside of academia as well, it's just exhausting. So it would be good to have this kind of work, you know, that's still considered non-traditional, to get the recognition that it, you know, deserves. And in terms of, you know, progression in your career, it does hinder your progression in your career because you're focusing on the, you know, building these relationships and doing this work instead of, you know, writing monographs.
Thanks, Mel. Susan, Katherine, do you want to add anything in? Or if not, we have another question from the chat I can bring in.
Just very quickly say that, you know, all my interest in working cultures, and I think there are real parallels between academia and things like film and TV, massively comes from my own experience of precarious labour, you know, before I got my lectureship. And that I recognise I was coming from a place of privilege, but I think that has really informed where I've gone. And it's something that's really important to my teaching now. So I will always teach activism, trade union. I will always embed this idea of structural inequalities in the workplace into my teaching, because I never want my students to start to internalize that their experiences as, you know, their fault or something like that. So it really informs kind of everything I do, but I don't want to say too much specific about specific institutions.
Great, thanks, Susan. Katherine, do you want to add anything, or I'll go to this question in the chat. Thanks. So Sue asks, Sue says she's interested in the importance of collecting and archiving records and artifacts that testify to activist involvement and campaigns. And I know, Sue, this relates to your own PhD, doesn't it? So if you want to unmute and say anything about it, please do. The material culture we're left with that can be invaluable in filling knowledge voids left by official accounts and academia. How have you drawn on collections relevant to your research, and what will you contribute to collections for the future from your research? Interesting, future collections, yeah. Any thoughts on that? Katherine, go for it.
Just that one of the things that I've been able to draw on to some degree, but it's been hampered a wee bit by COVID, is the fact that my project's looking at experiences of everyday life. And there's this incredibly rich existing like fountain of recorded information about refugee and asylum seeker and migrant experiences of everyday life, which is sitting in the archives of, or the archives, the organised community arts organisations. Like, there's so many creative projects, films, poetry, art. There's an absolute wagon load of stuff, and that for me is like this amazing document of, you know, writers groups in the 80s, and you know, it's an insight into something that I'm hoping to record oral histories with well, I'm going to record oral history, but I'm not going to get everybody in, you know. So it's this we look into communities, and I think it's such a rich source, and I don't see it used as much in academia as a source as I think it deserves to be, because it's just absolutely amazing. For me, I'm going to record the oral histories and keep the things that come out of it. So if we maybe the poems, and might do things like zine making and different creative activities. And then NLS are going to keep all that, and where people have consented to that, the National Library of Scotland, people are obviously, where they're happy with that, that's going to be then publicly available, because I think it's refugee history, it just is the history of Scotland, the history of immigration to Scotland. That's a really important part of the national story, and I'm really glad that it's going to be in there. So hopefully in 7 years, when I finish my PhD, it'll be in there and everybody can have a look.
Excellent, Katherine. I'm aware that we're at past, and as I said at the beginning, these sessions run by really, really quickly in our lunch hours, and it might be that some of the other three have responses to that question as well. But I thought perhaps in picking up that question, but also because we unfortunately do need to wrap up at the same time, perhaps I can just ask all four of you, just if you have any concluding remarks if you want to respond further to the questions around collections and archives, or what the future placing of your research might be as well. But otherwise, perhaps, just some final recommendations for early career researchers in particular working in this space. Who wants to go first? It's the kind of question I probably should have warned you about before we got going.
I'm happy for early career researchers to get in touch with me if they are, if they do want to talk about, how to work this way and how to embed these things in their own research, and how to, I think it was the person that Charlie that asked how do you do self-care. So I'm happy for anyone to contact me if they want.
That's great. Thanks so much, Mel. We might well have another SGSAH session focused on this, actually. I think it might be really useful for people. Thank you. Susan, Ben, Katherine?
Yeah, just to say, I'm happy for people to contact me too. I keep my sort of public, my academic part of me separate from like social media and things, which is actually really difficult, because if you're doing activist work, you need that social media presence. But for kind of what Mel was saying, I've always got a bit of a fear about being out in public and backlash and things like that. So, but I'll put my university address. I'm always happy for people to contact me there. And I think that the questions were great. So just wanted to say thanks to everyone for asking those questions.
Great, thanks so much, Susan. Ben, shall I draw you in next?
Now, obviously, as a white man, I don't find myself becoming a lightning rod for racist trolls and sexist trolls on the internet in the same way. So I am on social media, at least on Twitter, but I do it sort of the other way around to Susan. I mostly use Twitter professionally. Hope I'm not too often tweeting late at night while drunk, but maybe. The only other thing I wanted to add to this was that, well, actually two things. First, I don't know if anyone else got a crick in their neck trying to read the titles of the children's books on the shelf behind Mel, but I certainly did. Also, I really enjoyed this conversation, and it reminded me after the last 16 months or whatever of pandemic and relatively few events like this, that having this kind of conversation is actually really useful, and that if you're doing research that relates to activism and contributes to activism, solidarity research, as Katherine put it, then there are times when just stopping and talking through what that's doing to you, that can be really good. And again, thanks for all the questions. They've been really interesting.
Thanks, Ben. And Katherine?
Yeah, just the same as everybody else. I'm much less experienced in academia, but I have done lots of work with community partners. So if anybody wants to chat about that, I'd be delighted, and chat about solidarity. It's one of my favourite subjects. And just, it's been so great to hear about the work that everybody's doing. I feel really inspired, and I'm really delighted to hear what's going on. So thanks very much to everybody.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all four of our speakers. You've been brilliant and excellent contributions in the chat as well. I'm going to pick up in particular, oh no, it's going to fly up before I can say it, Rihanna's comment, who said, "Thank you so much for the amazing and powerful talks and advice. A stronger culture of care is so much needed in academia and elsewhere." And I think that's a great point on which to end, Rihanna. So thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you to the generosity of time of our speakers, and to all of you for listening. A reminder that we have a continuing series of daily keynotes throughout the rest of the week. You will see Ben again tomorrow, because he's very kindly agreed to chair Charlotte Lydia Riley's talk. Charlotte is based at the University of Southampton, and she's going to be speaking on Historians Under Fire, why historians need to speak out in the culture war. And I'm sure some of the themes of today will be picked up tomorrow. So I hope to see many of you there. Thank you once again to all of our speakers, and goodbye, and see you soon.